I am very excited to have Mel here today, who is not only an absolute visionary when it comes to all things enablement, but just an incredible founder, incredible revenue leader, and a great friend. We love this female founder friendships in this space. So very excited to be here. For those of you that are new, feel free to ask any questions in the chat for Mel as we go into the conversation. This is your opportunity to ask amazing leaders all your burning questions with today's focus on enablement. So, Mel, give us the quick TLDR. Who are you? Give us your background.
Love it. Hey, thanks so much for having me, by the way. Great to meet anyone that I haven't met yet. My name's Melanie Fellay. I originally grew up in Switzerland, but spent most of my adult life in the States and now the Caribbean. I started Spec 8 years ago. Before that, I was working at various startups, everything from like HVAC manufacturing to real estate crowdfunding platform in San Francisco. And Spekit was really born out of a lot of the pains that I felt around change management, really, but change management around, launching new products, launching new platforms, in our case, Salesforce. And, what I later learned was an enablement challenge. So that's how it all started.
I didn't know you grew up in Switzerland. That's a whole other topic we need to talk about.
I'm very Swiss. I spoke French for the first 13 years of my life. Yeah.
There you go. That's going to be for our follow-up conversation. So, um, tell me a little, how did you land on enablement? Like, was this something that you always wanted to solve or a problem space that always kept you up at night?
Not at all. I have like no background in enablement. It's funny when I look back, like I've always loved learning. Like I was a tutor in high school and then I was a stats TA in college. Like I always loved the process of like helping people see those light bulb moments and like thinking about how do you break down really complex problems into like the most simplest message possible so that next person can click. So I feel like I've always loved that aspect of like problem solving when it comes to learning. But no, I mean, I studied finance and accounting. I thought I was going to go down like, either investment banking or public accounting. And then I worked for a startup and then I got kind of into like biz ops and doing like pretty much all things around both data, technology. And then ended up like running teams. And I'd say like the recurring theme there was like from a data standpoint, I'd be frustrated because it was really hard for me to actually understand what was working or not in the business because people were entering information incorrectly, into our systems. Um, and then, trying to get teams up to speed with how fast our business was changing, our products and services was changing was really tough as well. And so I kind of stumbled into the world of enablement. We didn't have that, even 9, 10 years ago when I started thinking about the problem, enablement wasn't as prevalent as it is nowadays as like a function in a company. Um, and so I really just started looking for a solution like, how do I just make sure my people know what they need to know when and where they need to know it? And that quite quickly kind of like made me stumble into the world of LMS and CMS and digital option platforms and knowledge management solutions and kind of the chaos of all of these different approaches to trying to solve what I have kind of distilled into a pretty simple, like just making sure people know what they need to know when and where they need to know. So, it was definitely like an accidental process, but one that I've become obsessed with. So,
It's interesting. Something you said was enablement looks really different today from when you started Speckit, and I know it's going to look really different over the next 8 years as well. So can you talk a little bit about how it looks different today versus previously, and then we could get into what the future looks like as well?
yeah, it's funny. I almost don't love using the word enablement because I think, unfortunately, for companies, enablement is almost taking on a bad meaning in the sense that, companies have invested a ton of money into technology, into teams to try and solve this enablement challenge. But the challenge is that it hasn't been well defined. We've introduced 25 bajillion different frameworks and methodologies and all these different approaches. And I think a lot of companies looking back on those investments haven't necessarily seen that true impact. And so, depending on what technology you tried using, depending on how big of an investment you've seen, it can have a bad word. It can have a bad meaning, especially for CROs, especially for sales leaders that have kind of like started leading back on their managers. And so, like, my goal is to really kind of, I believe in the importance of enabling your teams to do their jobs as effectively as possible. I don't think that happens on its own. I do think that you need to have a strategy. You need to leverage technology, especially nowadays. Like, there's just no way that humans, right, an army of people can keep up with just how fast your products and services are changing. Like, I mean, if you look at just the rate of innovation, I know both of us run technology teams, like the way that our development teams are now using, coding software and, automating QA and like all these new technologies meaning that we're developing 10 times faster, right? You were at a conference recently and talked about, the holy grail back in the day was like the 10x engineer. Like, I do think you're moving more towards like, what is that 100x engineer? Now, with that pace of velocity, though, like your teams, your go to market teams are just so overwhelmed because there's so much faster changing your products and services. Your competitors and your landscape is changing every single freaking day. And then on top of that, just like the market, the business, like there's so much change happening. And I do believe that like you need to simplify that for your teams. And I just don't think that the old way of like, let's do a kickoff or like, let's do a training or let's do this event or let's have a repository works. Like companies need to think differently. And that's really been my thesis 8 years ago, but now even more so with how fast things are moving.
That is such a good point that I see with our customers that I haven't maybe said out loud yet. That one of the impacts of AI to go to market teams, maybe something they aren't thinking about day to day, but something they're impacted by day to day is how much faster they have to learn how to sell new product lines, new offerings, new competitive differentiation. And I mean, we see it in our own team, our own sales team. So, very, very interesting hypothesis. So for you, you said enablement then doesn't just mean sitting in a room and listening to a training or just having kind of a bunch of collateral stacked in a folder. What does it mean then?
Yeah, good question. So, uh, when I started the company again, I didn't come from like a traditional, learning design or enablement background. So I wasn't attached to like any way of doing things. And so I think in a way that was an advantage. Over time, I've learned that some of those, aspects matter more than others. But I'd say um, a a big thing that we've really focused on, that I've really focused on, is like what would an enablement experience look like if it was actually reverse engineered from the rep's point of view, right? If the whole goal of enablement is to ultimately ensure that the rep is ready in every single moment to sell, right? Whether that's going into a call, whether that's prospecting, whether that's responding to, a really intense procurement question, you name it, right? What would it look like if we reversed the user experience from a technology standpoint from their angle? And so that's where I focused, from a technology standpoint. How do we build an experience that I believe needs to be deeply contextual, meaning wherever the rep is, the enablement needs to find them, right? So whether they're in Pocus or Gong or LinkedIn or their email, like wherever they are, I believe they should feel empowered with the information they need. And then two, I believe it needs to be deeply personalized and tailored to them. So like we should be able to detect, hey, this is the specific deal they're working. This is what we know about the last call they had. This is what we know about past engagement. This is what we know about the rep and their profile, how tenured they are, what their role is, et cetera, and use all that context to really recommend the right content, the right information, right coaching, the right next steps, et cetera, as they're working. And then lastly, I think it needs to be really simple. Our product ethos is like simply it's spectacular, which is like, I think that you need to think really hard about designing this really predictive yet simple user experience because reps are inundated with cognitive load. So that's like the technology piece, which is like ideally it feels more of like a natural kind of like process or habit than like, let me go log into a software to do it. Ideally, it's almost like this natural extension of how they work. That to me is what like an effective kind of like enablement technology should look and feel to the rep. That a separate kind of view for like the marketing enablement teams, which I can speak to. I think from like a culture and from a team, like to me, I think we really need to elevate the profession of enablement. I think for the last, decade or so, so much of the exhaustion that I felt from customers and teams has been feeling like they're on the content creation wheel, right? Like, oh, we launched this thing. Let me go build this thing. Let me go launch this thing. Like, versus, hey, how do I really move towards being like more of a performance architect where, hey, I'm actually spending the time analyzing the insights from the conversations that we're recording to really understand what are the gaps and using that to form a strategy. And then really leveraging technology to automate the content as much as possible. And how do you spend more time both with and without technology, actually coaching and mentoring the individuals versus, hey, let's do a one-time, live training, a webinar that we're hoping people are going to absorb. So I think there's a lot of cultural changes. I wrote a lot about it in my book, but I think that the profession is going to change pretty drastically as we realize that more and more of like the kind of traditional tasks get automated.
Mel, what's your book called? Just to if folks can read it.
It's called Just in Time
Yes, it's incredible.
and World of AI. But yeah, that's what.
Yes. You said so much there that we could dive into. So there's something that you mentioned, which I loved, is the simplicity of the UI, which I totally agree. I think we're moving from enterprise tools like Salesforce, which were acceptable, to wanting all B2B software in the future, especially in the AI world, to be consumer grade. Before we dive into that, there's another thing you said that's very interesting around elevating the profession of enablement. I think some enablement teams get the kind of bad rep, and honestly, there's a lot of bad enablement teams where like sales reps are like, we need to get in this room and listen to them say something, and we just like zone it out. And then there's really good enablement teams that are really kind of leading the charge, pushing the business forward. What do you think is kind of the gap in between the two, and how can people make sure they're part of or leading the charge on those good enablement teams?
I mean, honestly, like I think it's a little bit unfair to blame the enablement team often, even though I feel that way. I actually think that that starts with like the culture and the leadership of the company, right? At the end of the day, if the CRO or the sales leader and frankly the CEO is not bought into the fact that in order for you to move as fast as you want to as an organization and for you to have a world-class sales organization, you need to enable your teams and you need to buy into it not as a yes, let's do that one training, but like as a philosophy, as a cultural norm in terms of performance management, etc. I think any enablement team is honestly set up to fail. And I think that's been true for a lot of teams. I do think that there's obviously aspects of like what needs to be true about like the people that you have on the team. I think that, generally speaking, this is very old, an overgeneralization. I've kind of seen two profiles of enablement professionals. You've seen those that have kind of like graduated from a traditional, like they've studied instructional design. They've really studied the science of how you learn and absorb information and how memory function works. And like they actually know how to really design effective um, training. The challenge is they don't necessarily have like the firsthand experience of actually being in the sales seat, right? Or you have the seller, right, that was a great seller and that kind of loved mentoring their peers, and kind of stumbled into being in that enablement role and has now built that career. Now, what's great about them is that they tend to have, you know, it's easier potentially for them to kind of like earn the respect of other because hey, I can speak your speak. I've been in your seat, et cetera. But they don't necessarily really have the best practices of like what great enablement looks like. And so I think there's been a lot of industry talk, a lot of the conferences that I've been to that are kind of trying to elevate that. But I think that that's part of the challenge is that you might have experienced kind of like one or the other. I think the right probably has a combination of both. I don't come from a learning design background, but I've spent as much time as I can over the years really studying like how memory function works, like and really designing like that's I think what people undervalue with like the value of just in time, like forget my specific solution, like, but the value of like in the flow of work learning, like there's so much science that actually backs up the impact that has on retention, right? Reinforcement repetition is how you retain information. Consuming information in context really matters for your like memory function. Like these things actually matter, just like how you design content, how you chunk information, like all those things actually matter to whether your team is going to absorb that information or not. And so you might have the best intentions, meaning you know how to sell, etc., but you're just, word vomiting it in a way that your team can't actually absorb it. And so I think that's where some of the good versus the bad kind of like actual like content and assets comes out or the design. But I also think that it has to come with like, does this person have authority in the organization? Are they 5 layers removed from the RevOps? Like all those things, or from the CRO, excuse me, all those things really impact whether an implement's going to be set up for success or not. Is it a back burner org, or are they part of the strategic conversations at the same and valued at the same level as like the RevOps peer?
I love the framework of the two different types of personas, and I know it's overgeneralization, but it is helpful. What do you think the future enablement persona looks like? Is it going to be a mesh of both, or are there other skill sets that people should be studying and preparing for?
Great question. In chapter 10 of my book, it's all about that. Kind of like the performance architect, but really like we just hired for enablement, and like one of the skills I really looked at is like being able to do proper data analysis, like really being able to huddle science. One of the questions I asked in the interview process is like, hey, what is the Salesforce report that you build that and relied on? And most professionals that I spoke to didn't know how to even create a Salesforce report because they leaned on their RevOps partner. I believe that like your ability to own your data is power, and that like only if you're able to really diagnose what's not working in the go to market function can you come to the table with the right insight and proposals on like what needs to happen. If you want to get out of like being on this content creation hamster wheel, like you need to bring value to peers. You need to spend time listening to calls. You need to be able to like be the voice to the CRO that RevOps is. If RevOps is responsible for like, territory management and really doing like proper like pipeline funnel analysis and like doing all that kind of like strategic work that helps you identify like, what are you right on your ICP targets? Where should you be focusing more, et cetera. I believe that like the role of enablement needs to be like really looking at like performance data, right? What are we seeing about like what are our top recs doing to prepare for calls that our bottom recs aren't? No one can freaking answer that call, that question. No one can answer that. What are your best reps doing? Right? What are the trends we're hearing on calls? What objections are coming up related to these new products? And how do we use that to really inform the strategy? And how do you, like, I recommend that you're sending a weekly update to your CRL that's, and come up with whatever those insights are for your business. But, like, what is the set of insights that you are uniquely responsible for providing to the CRO that positions you for a more strategic function versus just, oh, yes, we've had 5 people on the team not complete this training. Or, yay, we've had 80% of the team, complete the role play. Like that is not impact. That is not strategic. And frankly, I think the danger is that with how fast teams are moving, how fast companies are looking for like leverage and efficiency, right? Companies wanting to invest more in reps in their engineering teams and having to like ultimately cut back. I fear that if the function doesn't become more strategic, and with that, you need to be more data oriented, you need to be more insights oriented, it's gonna be similar to how it was 5 years ago, one of the first functions on the chopping block, and, like, that makes me sad because when done right, it is such a valuable asset to any organization.
Mm. I love the perspective of going from more reactive, kind of task-based to more strategic, brains of the CRO, kind of making things happen. What is this performance architect you speak of?
I I mean, honestly, it's just a silly name that I came up with. I don't know if that's the right name, but I think that the concept of like, hey, like you're really responsible for stewarding like the performance of the team and like you're using performance data to inform everything that you're doing. I talk a lot about it in like the different strategies, like, sales excellence orgs, et cetera. But to me, it's kind of like the step up for the function. Just kind of like, you're seeing this kind of evolution. And again, I'm oversimplifying here, but, a lot of kind of RevOps folks started being Salesforce admins or kind of like systems managers, right? Like you might have started in IT, then you became a systems Salesforce admin. I was a Salesforce admin at one point. Then you became like a RevOps person. Now you're upskilled to become like an AI go-to-market engineer and needing to learn new things. Like to me, enablement is kind of going, I believe needs to go through a similar evolution, which is kind of going from like, hey, like I, help create and deliver. I become a much more strategic role within the organization that's helping architect like how do we manage change in the organization, how do we leverage data to really inform performance, and how do we really understand what's working and what's not in terms of like performance of our reps to inform really like what you're doing on a day-to-day basis to enable the team.
I talk about that a lot as well, just the evolution of the RevOps role. And, when I was in RevOps, it started as sales ops, and we had one sales ops person, a Salesforce admin, and there wasn't even a concept of RevOps. I think my title changed to sales strategy, which really was more aligned to RevOps, but we didn't have a word for it yet.
You used to too? Like, did you manage
It's
this?
not. No. You are more of an expert than me on that. But it is interesting of as we go forward, and AI is going to be able to take over some of the manual task-based work, the skills that become so important, in my perspective, isn't that Salesforce admin work. It's the strategic, proactive work that, requires real deep thinking and partnership with across the organization, not just asking AI a question.
Um, and I think one of the metrics that this function has the opportunity to really own, again, in partnership with product marketing and product and others, is like speed to monetization. It's a metric I talk a lot about that I think is going to become more and more important in this world of AI, which is like, hey, how fast can we see the return on the investment we made in this, part of the product, et cetera, especially because like the pace, like there's velocity is increasing so fast that you're going to be able to just slap a bunch of features to your product if you want to. The question is like, how fast can you actually monetize that? Right. And like every day that goes by that your teams revert back to their old messaging, their old habits, that they're not able to like drive that change and bring that new messaging to the marketplace is really a lag between like that investment generating those returns. And so I think companies are going to get a lot more sophisticated in how they measure that. And that's really going to come down to change management and that, coordination across the different teams.
No, change management's a whole other topic, but let's do quickly there. Change management in the world of AI feels really hard right now because a lot of teaching your team at scale on how to use these new AI products that no one really knows how to use anyway. Like, how do you overcome that?
I mean, I think the challenge is that like most traditional kind of like change management frameworks and software is built around change being a project, right? But the reality is now like change is continuous. And I think like honestly, we have a lot to learn from like more of like our software engineering world. I talk about them in the book too, which is like, software engineers have took a model early on, like one kind of shifting from like waterfall to agile, right? And this idea that you're always going to be learning new things. So you have to kind of like, break down the work and gradually, taking those learnings to build. But then also, how do you break down your code? How do you break down the information into the smallest bits of information possible that you can like update and manage? I think that there's a lot to learn from that and how that translates to enablement. Meaning that I think like the days of let's create this, 70-page deck, persona deck, or let's create this 80-page sales playbook. Like, yeah, there's a reason why that's not working because there's no way for you to manage it. There's no way for you to govern it. If you make a change in it, what are you doing? Are you commenting like at the entire team, come see this change? Like, I think, and that's the second half of the book that I talk about, which is really content changes fundamentally, right? I think content needs to be much more broken down into small bits. I think for AI to actually work and function well, you need really clear instructions. And I think that like the more modular you make the information about your business and how you sell, et cetera, the more reusable it is and the more easy it is for you to govern that. And so, anyway, long story short, I think that change management, change enablement will evolve drastically as we kind of like adapt to how our technology evolves as well.
Hmm. Different topic. So ChatGPT exploded, and a lot of people think about ChatGPT and companies like Glean as the solution to enablement. What's your perspective on that?
Um, First, I love that any investment in enablement, I think, is a good one, right? Like at the end of the day, like companies that are like, we want to like give our recs and our tools to be enabled, great, thumbs up. I think that's great. I think at the end of the day, like my whole view on this space is that like companies are going to adopt what I would consider like the general purpose AI technology in their company, right? So whether that's Glean, Copilot, Gemini, Anthropic, you name it, they're all going to have this kind of like value prop of, hey, here's this, model that you can connect to all of your systems. And they're all going to have this optimized algorithm where they're going to guess to the best of their intent what the answer is that you're trying to get to. And you're going to be able to, if you'd like to, build all these kind of like custom agents on top. There's going to be a lot of maintenance there, a lot of DIY, et cetera. And I think that like companies completely underestimate the cost of maintaining anything. If you've ever built a CRM, you know what that actually looks like and how hard it is to get your data modeling right, your testing, et cetera. So anyway, all that to say, I think that those answers, if you have nothing, having a better answer to like basically federated search that gives you a more grammatically correct answer with sources is better than that. I think quickly what we're seeing with quite a bit of customers that have that is that like for a kind of general quick Q&A search of a doc, that's probably fine. And if that's what you're considering enablement, that's probably where you want to focus. Um, that said, I actually don't think that solves the problem of enablement whatsoever. I think that what wins in this new world is not any answer; it's the right answer. And we'll know that like connecting. I have yet to meet a single company in my 8 years of doing this that has a clean Google Drive, a clean SharePoint, a clean Confluence, a clean Notion. Like all these repositories become dumps. And until you solve the root problem of how do we actually prevent garbage in, meaning how do you start automating the accuracy of the information in the system, you're not going to solve the enablement challenge of getting the answer right. And what I mean by that is one, the piece of content from an enablement standpoint, like I don't see a world, even though I'm big on the just in time piece, I think that should be about 80% of the learning. I still believe that there's a time and place for like reps being in a focused state to learn something, right? So I still think you need to be able to have content that you digest in other formats. But two, I think that in order for the content itself to be accurate so that the answers are accurate, it needs to be connected to the system of truth. And so what I mean by that is um, if Glean responds with an answer, it's then just sending you back to that source content. It's not actually verifying, is that source content accurate, right? It's just referencing and pointing back. What I really focus on from an innovation standpoint is how do we actually solve that the information in the system itself, so in our governed repository, is accurate. And that comes down to a much more dynamic approach to content, which is, for example, something we've been testing internally is how do we keep our products information up to date internally, our product enablement, right? What we've been testing is, hey, can we actually connect to GitHub, to CodeRabbit, or to Jira to basically, with every time our engineers like push a PR to our production instance, we've built an agent that like basically checks whether this is a customer facing change or whether it's internal only, that basically uses the information from both the code base, the comments, the Jira ticket, the CodeRabbit, whatever solution we use, and then automatically generates release notes, and that syncs to Spekit. And we haven't gone into the next phase yet, but then how can we then identify conflicts? So like, hey, we just announced this new integration, let's just say, how can we now scan your battle card and all these other pieces of information now out of sync and suggest approvals? And so I'm really focused on making sure that the underlying information itself that your teams are relying on is accurate versus just hoping that like the LLM and the algorithm, point you to an answer. So I'd say that's a nuance in terms of like the actual accuracy problem. I think the larger piece is like if you actually compare like a true enablement experience like ours to that, there's a ton of capabilities that you just don't get in a more traditional kind of Q&A tool.
That is so smart. I want that. Does that mean that the role of does that mean that we can replace some of the work that enablement's doing? Like, do we think that there's gonna be smaller enablement teams? Because if agents can do all of that, that's pretty phenomenal.
Well, and I think that's my point. I think like so much of the time that enablement has spent on content creation and trying to gather and like and product marketing too. The role of product marketing is right. Like I think the first applications of AI is on this whole like content aggregation, and synthesizing. And I think a lot of that time now can instead be spent on like actually understanding what's working or not. Hey, you launched this initiative. Are people actually adopting it? What questions are you hearing on calls? How can you take that to adapt the information? Like all that work that we actually, I think, would love to have more time to do. I think we're going to get to a place where you actually have more time to do that. It's not that the function goes away. I think it becomes much more impactful and strategic. And you'll see those results on the team. But you need that data and you need some of these capabilities to be able to unlock that.
I love everything you just said. I mean, I know we chat a lot, but I still feel like my brain exploded with new perspective on how to think through enablement and things that I've haven't thought of before. So this was phenomenal. Mel, where can people find you? If they have questions, how can they learn more about Speckit?
Love it. Our website is spekit.com. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so feel free to connect with me there, Melanie Fellay. And then if you want the book, it's a separate website, justintimeenablement.com. And you can order a free hard copy.
Oh, amazing. Much for being here. This is incredible. You truly are the number one genius of all things enablement. So thank you for being here.
Jay, thanks for the invite. See you later. Bye.